So, just recently, Jake Paul announced the full card for the first ever Most Valuable Promotions MMA card, which is set to be aired live on Netflix on May 16th. And well, I have to say that the card for this event is pretty solid. It's definitely nothing crazy, and unlike what Ariel Helwani wants you to think, this card is not as good as the White House card, and as I've said in the past, the White House card itself is not a mind-blowing generational card either. However, for a promoter that is putting on its first ever MMA show, that is working with the minuscule pool of well-known top fighters who are no longer under UFC contract, this is a solid card. And I'm not only saying that because they have big stars from the 2010s like Ronda Rousey and Nate Diaz, or because they have arguably the best flyweight in the world in Muhammad Mokaev, or because they have the best currently active African fighter, Mike Perry.
Okay, I want to explain that I took a DNA test and the results came back French and German, British and Irish, and I was 2% African. So I am legally allowed to say the word nigga.
It's because when I look through this card, what I see is potential. Both potential future matchups depending upon who gets released from the UFC, and bright prospects that could go on to become the face of MMA outside of the UFC bubble. So in today's video, I'm going to briefly go over some of the big names on this card, and why exactly I think Jake Paul and Most Valuable Promotions may be able to really shake up the world of MMA if they play their cards right. So starting off with the main event, let's talk about Ronda Rousey versus Gina Carano. And well, there's a reason why I didn't include these two in the thumbnail of this video, and that is because, for me at least, this is the least intriguing fight on the card. And yes, that is including Chris Avila's fight, as well as Alex Pereira's sister, Eileen Pereira's fight. And here's the reason why. Ronda Rousey versus Gina Carano is a fight that might have been intriguing a literal decade ago. You know, which is around the time when Ronda Rousey lost to Amanda Nunes, and when Gina Carano was working on The Mandalorian. Having Ronda Rousey bounce back from her 2-fight KO loss streak against an actress working on what was at the time one of the most valuable media properties in the world would have generated quite a lot of hype. But having these two fight in 2026, when Ronda Rousey is 39 years old and Gina Carano is 43, this fight just screams Jake Paul versus Mike Tyson, Part 2 Electric Boogaloo, but in this case, both sides are washed. And the fact that this fight is set for 5 5-minute rounds is a major red flag. Like, just imagine how big of a snooze fest this can be if Ronda Rousey doesn't get a quick submission or Gina Carano doesn't get a quick KO. This fight really truly does have the potential to be the worst fight of the year if it goes to a decision. And although you have guys like MMA Guru saying this about the weigh-ins,
Carano looking great. I mean, the weigh-in's gonna go crazy! Dude, the weigh-in is gonna trend in ways you've never seen before. Okay, guys? Are they in shot? There you go.
Dude, how down bad do you have to be thirsting after a literal 43-year-old? Sure, prime Gina Carano was pretty hot, but she's almost old enough to be a grandmother at this point. And the other reason why I'm not hyped for this matchup is because, well, it doesn't have any future. Ronda Rousey versus Gina Carano is what amounts to an epilogue for these two women's careers. The pioneer of women's MMA versus the woman who, for better or for worse, made women's MMA a mainstay of the UFC. It is highly unlikely that either of these two have another fight after this one. And besides, if one of these two women were to have another fight, is there any opponent out there that would be fitting for them? I guess in Ronda's case, there's the Holly Holm rematch. But even if they were to do that, well, that's just another fight that the UFC should have done a literal decade ago. Ronda Rousey versus Gina Carano is just Most Valuable Promotions capitalizing on the smoldering remains of two stars that are very, very far past their prime, both physically and in terms of name value. However, the advantage of having these two headline is that this will get the more casual fans of MMA who remember the Rousey era and the McGregor era to tune in. And if those casual fans on Netflix end up watching the undercard, well, that's where things start to get interesting, because the undercard is where the real potential of this new MMA promotion really lies. Now, moving on, let's talk about Francis Ngannou versus Felipe Lins. Now, if you're at all invested in mixed martial arts, I'm sure all of you already know who Francis Ngannou is. The former UFC champion who left the promotion without having lost the belt, and the literal lineal MMA heavyweight champion, holding a title that goes all the way back to the first ever UFC that Royce Gracie won. A title that has been held by all-time greats like Kazushi Sakuraba, Fedor Emelianenko, Randy Couture, Daniel Cormier, Stipe Miocic, and now it rests with Ngannou. This has created a very interesting situation where if you're a heavyweight and you want a real legacy fight, not just a money fight, but a real legacy-defining fight, you need to fight Francis Ngannou, who is outside the control of the UFC and is likely never going to go back. And no matter how much the UFC tries to promote Alex Pereira, or Tom Aspinall, or Cyril Gane, or even Jon Jones as the baddest man in the world, as long as somebody doesn't beat Francis Ngannou in MMA, well, the lineal championship is going to stay with him. And therefore, MVP and Jake Paul having the lineal heavyweight champion of the world signed to them is a big deal. And that is because they have the potential to set up massive super fights for the lineal heavyweight MMA championship, depending upon who gets released from the UFC. Now, as was recently announced, this likely isn't going to happen with somebody like Alex Pereira, who has signed a new 8-fight deal with the UFC and likely won't be able to fight out his contract, but that still leaves a potential Tom Aspinall and Jon Jones fight, and here's why. First, starting with Jon Jones. After Jon ended up not getting on the UFC White House card, he ended up openly calling to be released from his UFC contract on Twitter. And while the UFC's contracts are incredibly restrictive, having a potential Francis super fight waiting out there for Jon may lead to the UFC giving Jon what he wants. And if they're not able to fulfill Jon's demands, well, there's a chance, however small, that they do end up releasing him and letting him go and fight Francis. And with how the UFC is being run nowadays, I wouldn't put it beyond them to fumble the bag like that. As we saw how they fumbled Islam versus Ilya for the White House card, because, according to the very trustworthy person that is Ali Abdelaziz, Islam Makhachev was sleeping. The UFC seemingly has an inability to get big fights done nowadays, and doubly so when those big fights require big money. And next, moving on to another future potential opponent for Francis, and based upon where things stand currently, the more likely option, let's talk about Tom Aspinall. So, as was announced a few weeks ago, Tom Aspinall has signed under Eddie Hearn's management. And Eddie Hearn is basically Dana White's #1 public enemy. And when you have the #1 public enemy, Eddie Hearn, saying this about Tom Aspinall's contract,
considering the problem that you have right now, are you actually going to look at fighter pay in the UFC? Because I represent the UFC World Heavyweight Champion. I'm going to bite my tongue a little bit for now. But what I will tell you is his contract is a f***ing disgrace. Right? A disgrace. And I cannot believe the money that he is on when you look at the commercial revenue that his fight would generate against a Pereira or against a Gane in a rematch. And honestly, if I'm Tom Aspinall, I'm looking at that contract, I go, I don't even think you should bother me. But he wants to come back. He wants to rematch Gane. He wants to fight Pereira. He wants to defend his world heavyweight title. The time you've paid your tax and paid your team, there's no point in even fighting. Especially when you had 4 operations after your eyes got gouged out. Like, it is, honestly, it is unbelievable. But I'm really glad that it's been highlighted.
You can end up seeing a potential future where Eddie Hearn and Tom Aspinall find a way to get Tom released from his UFC contract and have him end up fighting Francis on an MVP card. And if that fight were to happen, it would cause massive legitimacy issues for the UFC's heavyweight division. And I mean, the UFC heavyweight division is already in the gutter as it is. And now, just imagine if MVP is able to build up a solid heavyweight division around Francis Ngannou and potentially Tom Aspinall. That would be a true nightmare for the UFC and Dana White. However, that's still all just a pipe dream for now. Although this fight between Francis Ngannou and Felipe Lins is definitely laying the groundwork for such a potential reality. And well, there's a reason why I've only been talking about hypothetical matchups for Francis so far, and that's because, well, this fight between Francis and Felipe Lins is a massive mismatch. Felipe Lins is a 2018 PFL heavyweight tournament champion. However, 2 years after winning that tournament, he went on to lose to Andrei Arlovsky and Tanner Boser in 2020, and then dropped to light heavyweight, where he ended up having some success. But the point is that Felipe Lins, well, he's not a true heavyweight, okay? He's a natural light heavyweight, and not a great one at that. So yes, Francis Ngannou will destroy Felipe Lins. But what's truly intriguing about this matchup is not the matchup itself, but the very fact that MVP was able to get Francis, and what MVP may be able to do with him in the future. And well, even if we're just looking at this fight as it is by itself, at least we're going to get to see Francis Ngannou get another brutal highlight reel KO, right? Now, moving on to the fight that I really wanted to talk about on this card. Let's talk about Muhammad Mokaev versus Adriano Moraes. And well, although this fight is on the undercard and it's only for 3 5-minute rounds, I would say that this is my main event for this card. Muhammad Mokaev is without a doubt the best flyweight outside of the UFC and might be the best pound-for-pound fighter skill-wise as well. And here's the thing with Mokaev, okay? I didn't like Mokaev that much when he was in the UFC. I thought that many of his fights were kind of boring. And I thought that the homoerotic behavior that he displayed in the Manel Kape fight warranted a disqualification. And when you take into consideration all of the stuff he was doing behind the scenes like sucker punching people, I can see why the UFC released him. But the thing is, ever since Mokaev was released from the UFC, he has really grown on me. Like a weed. And that is in part because I have been watching Mokaev's fights outside of the UFC. And well, even though he's fighting lower level competition, he definitely has been getting more entertaining as a fighter. In his most recent fight against Gerard Burns in Brave CF, he won that fight with one of the slickest head kick combinations I've ever seen. And then you look at all the side quests Mokaev has been doing. He knocked out a guy with a body kick in Karate Combat, and he most recently had a grappling match against Arman Sarukian. And yeah, sure, Mokaev lost that by rear naked choke and he went out cold, but that was against Arman Sarukian, who is arguably the best grappler in the UFC lightweight division. Muhammad Mokaev survived against one of the best grapplers pound for pound in the entire sport for 7 minutes, despite being at a huge size disadvantage. And for that, he's earned my respect. And you add on top of that, how Mokaev has kind of calmed down a little bit after getting released from the UFC. He seems less arrogant, he seems more likable, and I think that's because getting cut from the UFC really did humble him. But at this point, he seems to have accepted it as a sort of growing experience. And to be frank, it's kind of fun to root for the guy who was kind of unjustly cut from the UFC despite being undefeated. And then, on the other hand, you have Adriano Moraes, who I'm also rooting for, but for different reasons. Now, most of you guys might know Adriano Moraes for being the guy who knocked out Demetrius Johnson in Championship back in 2021. And well, while Adriano Moraes ended up losing the trilogy against DJ, he is undoubtedly an elite flyweight. However, despite being one of the best flyweights in the world, do you know what Championship did to him after he lost to Yuya Wakamatsu for the vacant Championship flyweight title? Championship benched him for an entire year. Yes, it took Adriano Moraes an entire year to be released from his Championship contract. An entire year when he was 35 years old, at the very tail end of his career. And that is why I'm so glad that MVP decided to pick Adriano up. Adriano Moraes has paid his dues. He was fighting for 50k to show and 50k to win against Demetrius Johnson in their final fight. And here's to hoping that MVP will be able to pay Adriano Moraes enough for him to comfortably retire. And yes, when I say that, I do expect Muhammad Mokaev to win this fight. But I don't think Adriano Moraes will get finished easily. And I think this fight is going to be the most competitive and most intriguing fight on this entire card. And if Mokaev is able to get Moraes on his resume, there is going to be a very good argument that MVP has not only the best heavyweight in the world in Francis Ngannou, but also the best flyweight. And the reason why you could argue that is because, well, Muhammad Mokaev, he has a win over Charles Johnson. Charles Johnson is the guy who slept the current flyweight champion, Joshua Van. And now, just imagine if Manel Kape ends up beating Kyoji Horiguchi and then ends up becoming champion. Muhammad Mokaev has a win over Manel Kape as well, albeit that win should have been a disqualification, but still it's a win on the record. So Most Valuable Promotions has the potential to build up a guy who could become the consensus best flyweight in the world. And I'm not capping when I say that. This fight is going to be very high level MMA, and it has the potential to create a scenario where fans end up wondering, hey, does the UFC actually have the best fighters in the world? And that is why I'm actually so hyped for this fight. And I wish that it was for 5-minute rounds instead of something like Ronda Rousey versus Gina Carano. Now, moving on to Nate Diaz versus Mike Perry. Well, I think that this fight is actually going to be pretty dang fun, but I also don't think that it's going to be that high level or give most valuable promotions the argument that they have the best welterweights in the world. This fight is almost exclusively carried by name value, although unlike Rousey versus Carano, this isn't a dead-end fight. Both Mike Perry and Nate Diaz could be used to build up future welterweight prospects for most valuable promotions depending upon how they play their cards. For example, you could have Jake Paul make his MMA debut where he rematches Nate Diaz or Mike Perry in mixed martial arts, which is a bout that could potentially headline another MVP card. And then you have the potential to bring in prospects from other promotions to fight either one of these two, which could then be used to build up a welterweight division. I mean, even on just the undercard of this very card, you have Lorenz Larkin versus Jason Jackson. And hey, look, with Jason Jackson, he knocked out Yaroslav Amosov, who is probably going to be ranked soon in the UFC. So yeah, while I'm not that hyped for Nate Diaz versus Mike Perry, and I think that is mostly carried by name value, there is potential here to build something even greater and even better in the future. But now, moving on to another big prospect fight. I want to talk about Salhadin Parnasse, whose name I am absolutely butchering there, versus Kenneth Cross. Now, this is definitely a gimme fight for Salhadin Parnasse, but that's just because of how good Salhadin Parnasse is and not because Kenneth Cross is bad. Salhadin Parnasse is 22-2, with one of those losses being basically a fluke KO where he got hit on the head with a forearm, which he later on went on to avenge, and then the other loss is up at welterweight. Salhadin Parnasse started down at featherweight, and he ended up becoming a 2-division KSW champion at featherweight and later on at lightweight. Parnasse is one of the best fighters to have never competed in the UFC, and he's still just 28 years old. Parnasse is not just a major signing for MVP in terms of, getting top-tier talent. Him getting signed is going to bring in major viewership from Europe, and that is why I think that MVP definitely has the potential to challenge the UFC there. There are already major promotions like Octagon and KSW that are kind of eating into the UFC's monopoly over MMA in Europe. And if MVP is able to bring in top-tier talent from these promotions, MVP might end up becoming an alternative place for top-tier fighters to go as opposed to the UFC, which would then force the UFC to do things like put on better cards or pay their fighters more. I mean, the UFC already missed out on Salhadin Parnasse because the UFC basically just wanted to put him on a 10-for-10 contract. And if MVP is able to continuously offer the best fighters millions of dollars or even hundreds of thousands of dollars, they will be the ones getting the best fighters. But anyways, that's the end of the video. This was more just a quick reaction video that I wanted to get out as soon as I could when I had the time. And of course, I didn't go over the entire card, but overall, I think it's a decent card. And I think that having something, anything that can challenge the UFC and give them a run for their money is good in the sport of mixed martial arts. I am really looking forward to this card. And well, I will be watching this and Arnold Allen versus Meliquazel Costa basically at the same time because they're on at the same time, So yes, thank you for listening to my sort of unorganized thoughts on this entire card. Goodbye.